I was wondering, it's interesting what you're saying is about how you can actually bring Europe together by having everybody understanding and communicating having a single language. But there's a lot of things that strike me. Sometimes is that a view of Europe as it should be from a smaller country that's in the centre of Europe, say in the Czech Republic, whereas you get a different view for something like the UK, which doesn't feel the need to integrate its culture or its language because it sees its language dominating the world. So is there not a problem in that you've got a big communication problem in trying to get other countries to understand? I think France would be another example.
Yes, this is an important question, good question. You know, I was unable to quote more examples from the history, but I think that the European history shows clearly that the difference worked, that the communicated difference worked very well. English culture as well is very much indebted to what came from the continent. Yes, English language itself, and this habit of crossing the language borders and language barriers, I think belongs to maybe the most precious techniques Europeans developed. Mm-hmm. I think this is true for English as well. English, yes, I have little experience of English life, but I think that England was for a long time kept universal by its colonies. English never became only local, thanks to the colonies and to the whole empire. It's a question whether today they don't need another anchor outside of the domain of their own language. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, thank you. Okay, oh, you've got a question here. Let me just come down here, I've got to run down here with the microphone.
No. Professor Sokol, I'm Martin from Charles University Law School. My concern is you have mentioned the idea that multiculturalism, to become functional or productive, as you have said, has to be communicated. And I really don't get that idea. What do you mean by that? Thank you.
I can say maybe a few counter-examples. There where this language barrier is really a barrier, it creates the well-known dangers. But where people are accustomed to learn from the others and to be interested in the others, this is what I mean by communicating. That is, I quoted the example that we as Czechs are so much indebted to the Germans, maybe to the French, to the Italians. Yeah? Whatever was of importance in Czech history, most of it came from abroad. And this is something which, on the other hand, the difference makes, I would use an biological example. Biologists today are convinced that we have to protect biodiversity, not only for sentimental reasons, but for example, in the case of plant diseases. Wherever people cultivate the same crops, there is the huge danger that there comes some epidemic which destroys all of it, like in the famous Irish potato illness in the early 19th century. Whereas this difference can be a barrier or at least a hurdle for example, for ideologies, for dangerous ideologies. This is the one side. The other side is, as I said, that this tendency to form closer societies helps to create areas of mutual trust, which is for even in modern societies extremely important, for example, in economy. So I think that the utility of diversity is not proven, but there are good reasons to believe in it. But only in the case when the neighbors, different neighbors, knew about each other and learned to appreciate, to value the other. This is what I mean by communicating. Is it a response?
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Okay. Oh, sorry. Just take, this will be the last question, and then we must move on to the panel discussion. It's Robert, isn't it?
Robert Bohat from the International School of Prague. I totally agree that the communicated diversity is a helpful thing. I work in an international school where students from Muslim countries and from Israel and from Armenia and from all these places that often come from areas of conflict learn to use English as a lingua franca, and in English they will use all the politically correct language and restrain themselves, and it will look really nice. But then they switch to their mother tongue, and I understand some of those mother tongues, and I see a totally different communication. So it seems like it's working on this level, but what else does it take to get to the real appreciation of the otherness of others, other than just a political superficial paint that doesn't really change the hatred inside?
Yes, thank you. This is a small picture of what Europe has been until 1950. Namely, a community, a jigsaw mosaic of various national communities, which all of them believed in democracy, believed in humanity, proclaimed everything, but never spoke to each other. So if your students still discuss among them in national or cultural units, so there is no communication. There is only this proclamative universalism, which is bound to English. But the problem would be that they should speak in English, probably, among themselves. This would be crossing the barrier. This cannot be replaced or by a layer of superficial universalism like it was in the past.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so I'm just going to move on to the panel discussion now, and what I'm going to do is actually going to bring some chairs to the front, because I'm worried that our guest speakers will disappear in the comfy chairs and you won't be able to see them. So I'm just going to sort that out now. Thanks, David. Yeah, I think it'd be better so you can see me here. Okay. Do you need the mic at all?
I think we should perhaps now hold them. Yeah.
What I'll do is I'll come down with the questions.
Okay. Yeah, yeah.
Before we start. Okay, all right, okay. Okay, we're ready, gentlemen? Okay.
When you are.
Yes, all ready. Okay. Right. Shall we open the discussion? Who's got a question for our panel? We've been sitting here all day, and you've saved up your question, and now's your opportunity to ask it. Don't be frightened. Sorry? Of course you can. Here. I'll give you the microphone. There you go. No singing.
Okay. I'm a bit puzzled with the terminology. Yeah, like you mentioned lingua franca, international language, global language. Are there any differences when we call English these names, or are they the same in general?
You mean whether? Yes, maybe it was my fault. I didn't want to distinguish between lingua franca and global language. there were, until, yes, recently, as Professor said, until the 60s, we had world languages, Weltsprachen in German, yes, and there were many. Since the 60s, there is only one Weltsprache, one world language, and this is English. I normally prefer the word lingua franca, but it's for me practical. In modern days, in today's, it's the same like global language.
I think one of the problems is that some people are trying to use terminology of this kind in a specific way that did not exist before. The people who talk about ELF, English as a lingua franca, for example, they have a very specific notion of what it is compared with the more general concept that Jan's talking about and that I would traditionally also use. For me, I didn't make a distinction either. But once somebody comes along and says, let us now define the characteristics of English as a lingua franca, then you suddenly realize that you're dealing with a very specific point of view. Now, what do they mean, the people who talk about ELF? What they mean is that if you go around the English-speaking world, to all the people who are learning English as a second language or a foreign language in any part of the world, there will be some features in common, which means that there is a kind of formal identity to English as a lingua franca. And the problem is that this position has been presented as if it were a fact, whereas in fact it's really just a hypothesis. What are these features of English as a second language that everybody uses, that you use when you learn English, when the Chinese, when they learn English, when everybody learns? And you suddenly realize that there are not, it's very difficult to define. And people are exploring this, of course, at a research level. I'll give you one example. There are uncountable nouns in English, are there not? Furniture, not furnitures. Information, not informations, and so on. But around the English-speaking world, when you hear people learning English, they often say informations and furnitures and things. Now, traditionally, this would be said to be wrong. This is not correct English. But if everybody is doing it all over the world and saying to themselves, well, why shouldn't we say furnitures or informations? And when you notice that in the early history of English, informations did exist as a plural in Middle English, people say, well, maybe it's acceptable to say informations. Why should I not say informations? And if 9/10 of the English-speaking world says informations is correct, what does the remaining 10th do? I mean, what do native speakers do? Eventually, some native speakers will start saying informations, and perhaps in 50 years or 100 years' time, the whole world will be saying informations once again. Now, this is what is meant by lingua franca English, that the majority of people who learn English as a second language are speaking it in an individual sort of way because of all sorts of reasons, and this is then going to become a kind of norm, if you like, or a model for future language teaching. Now, this, of course, is quite controversial, but this is one of the ways in which a term like English as a lingua franca is being differentiated from the concept of global English that I was talking about earlier, and I think Jan talks about it really in the same way, and that is that I don't see global English as being a single homogeneous thing with all second language learners using it in the same way. What I see is difference. I don't see similarity so much, I see difference. I see Ghanaian English and Nigerian English and Singaporean English and so on. Obviously there's a certain amount in common, but there's a significant amount that differentiates them. So I'm a bit suspicious of ELF as a kind of premature attempt to recognize greater similarity than in fact exists. And I would want to maintain a distinction in terms between global English, which is the set of Englishes that exist around the English-speaking world, where there is no particular identity in play at times, from a view which says that there is a growing movement to have a similarity of English around the English-speaking world.
Okay. So can I take another question here?
Related to what you were just talking about, our job as English teachers, or English as a foreign language teachers, is to train generally Czech-speaking students to communicate with people who don't speak Czech, not generally native speakers. With regard to what you were saying, the difficulty for us is to find as standard an approach as possible. Our students benefit from the standardization. How can we go about teaching them things that are going to be valuable and universal if the increased trend is for individualized Englishes?
Well, this, I think, relates to the point I was making this morning about production and listening comprehension and reading comprehension and so on. I mean, above all else, as a teacher, I think one has to be realistic. One has to recognize the realities. I mean, you know, the whole point of Jan's talk is to show the history of ideas in this connection, in which things are never the same. Things shift in all sorts of different ways. We are working through an amazing transitional period at the moment. It is quite extraordinary. As I said at the end, once upon a time it was pretty straightforward. You know, I knew what standard English was. It was standard British English, and there we are. And then the Americans come along and take over the world, and now it gets a bit more difficult because it's American standard English versus British standard English, but I can handle that. And then the Australians come along and say, well, hang on a moment, you know, in our part of the world, we do things differently, and now there is a third kind of standard coming along. And if you actually go down and teach English in Southeast Asia, you'll find that you're teaching Australian English standards more than British or American ones, because that's the norm in that part of the world. And it's not as that there are massive differences, but there are important differences. Like we say pavement, Americans say sidewalk, and Australians say footpath. All right, well, you have to know that sort of thing. Otherwise, in that tiny little way, you're not teaching the standard. Now, the question is, how many standards are there as you go around the English-speaking world? The ELF point is making the point that there is a new kind of standard emerging, which is actually arising out of second language learning strategies. In other words, you're teaching your own standard, the standard that is a new kind of correctness, if you like, because you suddenly realize that the English your Czech students speak is actually exactly the same as the English, or close to the English that, say, German students speak, and Hungarian students speak, or Italian students speak, and none of them are speaking standard British English. In all sorts of subtle ways, they are differentiating from them. And that's the strength behind that approach. Well, you know, I don't know what the solution is to this, because it's all so recent. We're talking about a trend that's less than 20 years old. That's why I said at the end, you're in a very difficult, tricky position at the moment. But I think the best thing is to bring the students into your confidence, to explain the complexity of the situation, point out that you're going to have to choose one standard because you have to. I mean, you have to start somewhere. And we're going to choose what? British English because that's the tradition, or American English because that's the tradition you're familiar with, or whatever it is. But at the same time, point out variation when it exists. I can't see any other way of doing it. What about you?
Yeah, I think I would say I would be more Platonician in this point. You know, English, you use the word Zimbabwean English or Jamaican English, but you always call them English. This has some good reason. There is something which is English in all of them. I don't mean that it could be defined strictly. But I think that what colleague asked is just this. There is something, yes, general ideal of English, which you should teach the students. The students, your students probably are not all of them future linguists, to distinguish the various dialects and so on, but they have their aim is to understand and to speak, to communicate in English, most, if possible, all over the world. This is the the
No, yeah,
important value
absolutely
of
right.
English.
Yeah. We must not exaggerate the extent of the difference.
Yeah.
I mean, when you ask, I said, I gave you some statistics. For my lecture, I was sort of drawing attention to the differences. But don't exaggerate them. You think 10,000 words is a lot for South African English? There are 1 million words in English. 10,000 is not a big deal, really. Most of the words in English are shared by the varieties all around the world. The grammar, the number of grammatical differences in English around these different dialects, less than 5%. 95% of the grammar of English is the same wherever you go. And so, while one does need to acknowledge the extent of these differences, the existence of these differences, I think most of the time, there are no differences. And so you'll carry on doing exactly the same as you did before without any worries, so long as, when the point comes up, you draw attention to the differences. So when you start teaching, say, the present perfect, and you're traditionally used to teaching, I have gone, I have seen, I have this, that, and the other, then point out that in America they often just say, I ate, I went, and they don't, for the same meaning. Even though you're teaching the students to do the one that you're familiar with, remind them that there are alternatives here. You don't have to do that very often, but when it comes up, it's worth doing. Otherwise, the kids go away, and they're sharp kids, as I said, and they go to the internet, or they go to a newspaper, and they come back the next day and say, Miss, yesterday you said we should never do this, but Barack Obama has just done this. And then you lose credibility straight away.
A question here.
I'd like to ask a question by disagreeing with what you just said. Because you said that the differences, and you mentioned the difference in being mainly in the lexicon, and you mentioned vocabulary, and you said that differences in grammar are not so frequent and visible. And my question is, to play the devil's advocate for the future of English and paint a catastrophic scenario, whether there are not differences lying deep underneath. Because Professor Sokol, you said that a child, through their mother tongue, they construct the reality around themselves. And then they project this reality into the language that they learn as the second language. And I'm thinking of the work of Lakoff and Johnson here. Whether we don't end up eventually in a situation when we all speak some kind of English, we kind of find the overlapping areas of the many Englishes there are, but we actually understand our English very differently from the Englishes spoken by the other people. Whether we are not heading for some kind of disintegration of the language by projecting our realities into it.
Maybe if, the same problem which was just mentioned exists inside the language. Every human, as I said, every child constructs its own language from scratch. And so there exists an innumerable plenty of what linguists call autolects. And it's only by schooling and by media and so on that these autolects are somehow kept together to form a standard language. So I think that it is very important to keep up a sort of standard language, even if trying to be tolerant to the differences. But if we give up this standard, then we run the danger that the dialects will run away and people lose the ability to understand each other. And then the function of language is broken. Yeah? So in my opinion, it's, of course, a linguist has the temptation to see the points there, the different points. But as long as they don't hinder understanding, they are okay. You can tolerate them, but you should keep a sort of standard to measure the distance which is tolerable and which is not.
Yeah. There are two forces always driving language. One is the need for intelligibility, the other is the need for identity. You know, they're both there. We need both.
Yeah.
I want to understand you, you want to understand me. That's intelligibility. That means we need a standard language. On the other hand, I am not you and you are not me. I want to be me, I don't want to be you. I want my identity. So that fosters local dialects, local accents, local languages, minority languages, and so on. Now, these two forces are often seen to be in conflict. I never see them that way. I see them as complementary. I see the need for both. I come from Wales. I speak English to you now. I don't speak Welsh to you now. For obvious reasons, but go back home and I can switch into my Welsh if I need to, or into my Welsh accented English if I need to show my identity with the people in my area. Now, I have a skill in both. We all have multiple skills of this kind. And so I think the first thing is to try and achieve that kind of balance between the two. If one does, then there is no conflict, to my mind, of the kind that you mention, because you just, as it were, switch mindsets in a way. Now, the other thing about these mindsets, which goes back to the point Jan made just at the beginning of his commentary there, is that this isn't restricted, indeed, to different languages or different dialects. It goes right down to the level of the individual person. Now we're talking about men are from Mars and women are from Venus. Are we not? You know, the husband and the wife, the husband says, you know, I just don't understand a word you say. What does that mean? You know, and usually actually the wife says to the husband, I think, I don't understand a word you're saying. But what does that mean? In one sense, they are speaking the same language. In another sense, they're not speaking the same language. So these issues of interpreting the agenda, the cultural or personal or political or gender or whatever it is, behind the language you use, I think is something which is part of the human condition, actually, and isn't just restricted to the sort of area that you're talking about. But when these things are dealt with at that general level, well, it can be the case that the identity issue overrules the intelligibility issue to the extent, to go back to your point, Jan, people stop calling their variety a variety of English. It hasn't happened very often, but it does happen. So in Papua New Guinea, for example, they don't talk about Papua New Guinea English. They feel that their language is so different that they give it a completely different name, Tok Pisin. In Scotland, you know about Scotland, I suppose, there is a huge controversy, it's been going on for decades, whether the Scottish English that you associate with a poet like Robbie Burns and all of that is to be called Scottish English or to be called Scots. And Scots means different language. And this is hugely controversial. I mean, people will almost come to blows over whether Scots is a variety of English or not. And in America, a few years ago, there was a movement to consider Black English a different language. Some people suggested it should be called Ebonics. You may remember the name, Ebonics. And that was hugely controversial as well. So there does come a point when people feel we are so far removed from the original English that we must stop calling it English, and at this point all those issues that are at the back of your mind there sort of come to the surface and become a really contentious hotbed of controversy. You're right.
It is even more complicated. To make it even more complicated, think about it that if you have a newborn child, you will start communicating with it without it is in no command of language, and nevertheless you find means how to communicate because you want it, and the child as well. There is a beautiful story by the Russian linguist Jakobsen, who describes how fishermen in Norway found a common communicating language between Russian and Norwegian. And the Norwegians called it Maya Patvayu, mine according to yours.
Okay, have we got another question? Oh, over here. Sorry, I'll come to you second. We've got time for a couple of more questions.
So resulting from the fact that most of us are English language teachers, which means that we think a lot about how we present these language issues to the students. So I think that it's important to see the difference between spoken English and also between the aspect of exams, because a lot of our students aim towards, for example, the IELTS exam and the Cambridge exams. And in this case, for example, the example like information versus informations cannot be presented or accepted, because I'm sure the IELTS exam does not accept the version informations, which is a mistake very common among our students. So I think the students really need to pass these exams, so it is important to explain these things to them. What is acceptable in spoken English?
Yes, absolutely. You've got to explain. The point is the students will encounter these variations outside the classroom. Think of how many hours you have with any one student in a given week. Think how many hours of potential English they're experiencing on the internet when they leave you behind and off they go to Facebook or wherever they're going. And there they will see all these variations, and they've got to be able to make sense of them. So there's nothing wrong with saying to the kids, look, if you're doing the IELTS exam, then you'd better do the following thing, otherwise you won't pass the exam. I mean, every kid will understand that. On the other hand, there are different levels of acceptability in the outside world, and you will encounter informations amongst these other things. And if you're in that kind of environment, there's no reason on earth why you shouldn't use it, but don't use it if you're speaking formally, speaking on a formal occasion, writing an exam essay, using the written language. Not yet. Maybe in 100 years' time, you'll find it's acceptable, but at the moment, no. A better example, you see, would be something where you get the two alternatives equally acceptable in different parts of the world, like, say, using gotten versus got, a British English versus an American English alternative. Same thing here, you see. I mean, what is the examining board going to expect from the students? And if you know very well, from your experience of the exam and everything, that they expect British English and not an inconsistent uncertainty about what to do, then you'll teach got. On the other hand, to say that got is the only way in which English speakers around the world express that notion would be hugely misleading, because of course for every one got speaker in the world there are probably 2 or 3 gotten speakers in the world. And so I think one just, as I said earlier, takes the students into one's confidence and simply explains the reality of the situation while focusing very sharply on that form of English which you know is going to be best for them.
Thank you. Okay, we've got time for one more question here. Okay, Dasha, maybe. All right, since you work for the British Council, so I have to. Okay.
Thank you. My question is easy. I'd like to ask both our professors, what's your next book is going to be about?
I have no book in view now. I am a victim of my previous books, which are reprinted, and I have to remake them periodically, so I have no time to write a new one.
Oh, you lucky man. I have the opposite problem. I don't know about next, but the book that's just out I mentioned in the talk, the You Say Potato book, which is a book about English accents. The next one that'll be out in April is a jointly written book with my son Ben, which is a dictionary of Shakespeare for schools. It's an illustrated, full-color dictionary of Shakespeare aimed at teenagers, really. And it's been a very tricky book to do because, you know, writing the definitions for that level is quite hard. Anyway, my son Ben is an actor and a Shakespearean director and so on, so he's added a kind of actor's perspective, Shakespeare on the stage, not Shakespeare in a book, you see, but Shakespeare on the stage. So that's the next joint publication. And then the next single-authored book, which will be out next September, is, I don't know whether you know, but a couple of years ago I wrote a book on English spelling called, what was it called? Spell It Out. Was it called? Yes, Spell It Out. This is a companion volume. It's on the history of English punctuation, and it's called Making a Point. Making a Point, and it'll be out next September.
I would like to ask, how do you see the role of national broadcasting, either radio or television, for the sort of keeping the level of that standard English?
National broadcasting. Yes, this is quite interesting because national broadcasters influence language by reflecting it, if you follow me. The whole point is that the most popular programs are those which, well, you know the term reality television and so on, reflect the realities of what is out there. And scriptwriters are very conscious of the need to make sure that the language that they use in their soaps and in the plays and so on, the audience, the listening or viewing audience can identify with. So for the most part, national broadcasting influences language by bringing to the attention of a wider public usages that previously might only have been known to a smaller part of the listening or viewing public. And then everybody gets to know them and they become more widespread. And that seems to be the tradition. The big change that's taking place at the moment, it seems to me, is that the control that those guys have is disappearing in the face of the internet. You see, the national broadcasters are in control. I know because I've submitted scripts to them many and many a time, and you think that what you hear or see is what I wrote? No. It's what I wrote after it's been through the mill of the producer looking at it, the head of the department looking at it, and the changes introduced into it. You can't say that, David. No, you must do it this way. No, you mustn't say that. That won't be understood. And so it's edited and edited and edited until you get a kind of almost sometimes bland script that will not upset anybody, you see. Now, in that sense, to get an influence into the language, you've got to be really distinctive, you've got to be a Barack Obama, where they don't do that. So, yes, we can. Now, everybody knows about yes, we can. If you'd given that to a national broadcasting copy editor, they would have said to him, oh, no, you can't say that. You must say, yes, you may, or something. You know, I mean, they'd have messed it up in some way. Now, the internet is changing everything because on the internet, there are no such copy editors or people in power. So the stuff I write on my blog is what I wrote. Nobody has looked over my shoulder and said, David, no, you should put a comma in there. Or, David, no, you've spelt the word realize with an S, and it should be realize with a Z, or the other way around, you see, because both spellings exist in English, don't they? And so that doesn't happen on the internet. So in fact, I think the limited influence of the national broadcasters over the past century, they have had some influence, yes, of course, especially in developing standard accents and notions like that. But that's going to be less important as time goes by. And what we'll see on the internet is a more demotic set of influences as we, that is anybody who uses the internet, makes their usage preferences known, first of all through their fingers, and then eventually, as I was saying earlier, through their mouths. And we're already seeing this happen. I mentioned spelling a few seconds ago. Everybody would love it, wouldn't they, if English spelling was reformed and made simple. It would be great. We would waste so much time learning how to spell and we'd save time. That's never happened. But on the internet, people are already beginning to simplify English spellings in a way that was unacceptable before, but is now acceptable simply because most people are doing it and they're copying each other. And one day, maybe, some of these simplified spellings are going to become normal for all of us. So I think the internet's going to have a much greater influence than anything else. I must give you one example, otherwise you won't know how to remember this point. I've been studying the history of rhubarb on the internet, the spelling. How do you spell rhubarb? R-H-U-B-A-R-B. Where does that H come from? In Middle English, it wasn't there. It was put in by people with a classical background who thought it should be there. But we don't say rhubarb or anything in English, do we? On the internet, people are starting to leave the H out. Now, in 50 years' time, maybe it'll be perfectly acceptable to spell rhubarb without an H. That's the point I'm making, that the internet is allowing us to do things that the national broadcasters never allowed us to do. So I think in the future, that'll be the greater influence. Do you think so, Jan? Do you think the internet is going to be really influential in that way?
I think so, yes.
Yeah.
It is just now it makes a big influence on language. For example, those SMS, yes, this is text messages, they create a new version of language, even in Czech. It's a very, very poor language and so on. So I think that this can happen, but I think that teachers should nevertheless keep the flag of this is right.
Okay. Sorry.
Because, yes, what is IELTS to do if everything is okay?
Okay, thank you very much. That's a very interesting note to finish on, yes.